You've heard of World War II, the global fight for freedom, democracy, and human rights. But what if I told you that in the very heart of the land of the free, freedom itself was locked behind barbed wire? Imagine this. It's February 19th, 1942. You wake up to the sound of the radio. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's calm, authoritative voice cuts through the static. He's signing Executive Order 9066. You don't yet know it, but that single order will destroy everything you've ever known. Within weeks, your home, your job, your school, all gone. Why? Because your grandparents were born in Japan. You're not a spy. You've never even left California. You were born in Los Angeles, maybe Seattle, maybe Fresno. You recite the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. But suddenly, the country you pledged loyalty to doesn't trust you anymore. The FBI knocks on your door before dawn. They tell you that you and your family have 48 hours to pack whatever you can carry. 1 suitcase per person. You look around your living room, the couch your father built, the radio your mother saved for, the family photos on the wall, and you realize none of it's coming with you. You're told this is for your own safety, that the government is protecting you. But the soldiers outside your window don't look like protectors. They look like jailers. Your neighbors watch as you're loaded onto trucks. Some avert their eyes, others whisper. You try to meet their gaze, but all you see is pity or fear. At the train station, you're herded onto old freight cars, the kind used for livestock. There are no seats, no bathrooms, no windows. It's sweltering, suffocating, and smells of sweat and panic. Children cry. Mothers try to comfort them with trembling hands. Soldiers shout orders you barely understand. When the train finally screeches to a stop, you stumble into a world that feels like a nightmare. Stretching before you is a desolate landscape. Endless dust, scorching sun, and rows of crude wooden barracks. Barbed wire glints in every direction. Guard towers loom overhead, manned by soldiers with rifles pointed inward. Welcome to your new home. You're not told where you are, only that you'll be living here indefinitely. In reality, it's one of 10 Japanese internment camps scattered across the American West. Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain, Poston, names that will echo through history as symbols of betrayal. Inside the camp, the reality hits hard. Each family is assigned a single room, roughly 20 by 20 feet. The walls are thin, made of tar paper. Wind seeps through every crack, carrying the smell of desert dust and human despair. There's no insulation, no privacy. At night, the temperature plummets. During the day, it burns like fire. Toilets? Communal. Showers? Ice cold, shared with no partitions. Meals? Canned meat, watery soup, rice. You line up in the mess hall 3 times a day, trays in hand, your name now reduced to a number. The food is often spoiled. The water tastes of metal. The dust never leaves your skin. You hear whispers. Maybe it'll only be a few weeks, but weeks turn into months, months into years. Children adapt faster than the adults. They turn the dusty yards into baseball diamonds. They draw on scraps of cardboard. But even they sense the tension in the air, the loss, the humiliation. One night, your father sits on the edge of the bunk and says quietly, "America has forgotten us." You want to tell him he's wrong. But deep down, you're not sure anymore. The government calls it relocation. The newspapers call it evacuation. But make no mistake, it's imprisonment. And you are a prisoner, not for what you've done, but for who you are. When photographers arrive, they tell you to smile. They say the world needs to see how well you're being treated. So you stand, stiff and silent, while your photo is taken in front of your barrack, barbed wire just out of frame. Your smile forced, your dignity gone. Letters from the outside world are censored. Guards read everything before it reaches you. Packages are searched. The line between safety and suspicion has vanished completely. But inside the camp, a quiet kind of resistance grows. Teachers start secret classes for children. Families create tiny gardens in the dry soil, coaxing life out of nothing. Artists carve sculptures from scrap wood. They refuse to let their humanity be erased. Still, there's anger, a deep, simmering fury. Some men volunteer to fight in the U.S. Army, desperate to prove their loyalty. Others refuse, saying, "How can we fight for a country that locks up our mothers?" It divides the camp. Brothers stop speaking to each other. Fathers and sons argue late into the night. Even loyalty becomes a weapon. As the months drag on, you begin to forget what freedom feels like. The sound of trains passing outside the fence feels foreign. A world that's moved on without you. Some nights, you dream of home. Then you wake up to the creak of the barrack walls, the wind howling through the cracks, and the cold realization home doesn't exist anymore. Outside the camps, life continues as normal. The war rages overseas. Propaganda posters tell Americans to watch for spies. Movies and newspapers spread fear about the enemy within. Few question where 120,000 Japanese Americans have disappeared to, because asking questions is dangerous in wartime, and silence is easier. But not everyone stays silent. Some lawyers, journalists, and clergy speak out. They call the camps unconstitutional, inhumane, un-American. They're ignored, ridiculed, sometimes even threatened. One of them, Fred Korematsu, refuses to go quietly. He challenges the government in court, arguing that the internment is illegal. The case reaches the Supreme Court, and he loses. The court rules that the mass incarceration of citizens based on race is militarily necessary. In that moment, the Constitution itself bows to fear. Inside the camps, word spreads of the decision. You can feel the collective heartbreak, the despair. If the Supreme Court won't protect you, who will? Winter arrives again. Snowdrifts pile against the barracks. You wrap your blanket tighter and listen to the wind. It sounds like freedom, distant, unreachable. But you survive. You endure. Because survival here has become an act of quiet defiance. And yet, the story is far from over. Because what happens when the war ends, when the gates finally open, will be another betrayal entirely. Before we continue, take a second to imagine this. If your government suddenly decided you were the enemy, could you stay silent? Or would you speak up, even when the world didn't want to listen? If you believe stories like this shouldn't be forgotten, subscribe, because what comes next will reveal just how deep America's betrayal went. When the war finally ended in 1945, the air across America was filled with victory cries. The radio blared news of surrender. Soldiers returned home to parades, and the streets were alive with celebration. Yet far from the cities, behind the barbed wire fences of the internment camps, there was only silence. The war had ended, but for over 100,000 Japanese Americans, freedom had become a hollow word. One day, without ceremony, an announcement came. The camps were closing. The government declared that those imprisoned were now free to go. The word free carried a bitter edge. After 3 long years of confinement, humiliation, and loss, what did freedom even mean? Each family was given a one-way train ticket and a government stipend of $25. That was the value placed on 3 years of stolen life. Stepping beyond the gate wasn't like returning home. It was like walking into a world that no longer recognized you. The house your family had owned before the war was gone, sold off for next to nothing. Your father's store, once a source of pride and survival, was now someone else's business. Former neighbors avoided eye contact on the streets. Some whispered that it was better if you didn't come back. You weren't an enemy anymore, but you weren't welcome either. The barbed wire may have disappeared, but the walls had followed you home. The government moved quickly to erase what it had done. The camps were dismantled, their barracks sold for scrap. The fences came down, the towers were demolished, and the desert winds buried the evidence. The official story that remained was carefully crafted. The internment had been a necessary measure, an unfortunate but justified act during wartime. The public accepted this explanation easily. After all, it's easier to forget a wound when you're not the one bleeding from it. For decades, silence became the defining legacy of those camps. Many Japanese American families chose never to speak about their experiences. Children born after the war often grew up unaware that their parents had spent years imprisoned by their own country. Some survivors buried the memories so deeply that they almost convinced themselves it hadn't happened. But trauma has a way of whispering through generations. It shows up in the stories that aren't told, in the quiet pauses during family gatherings, in the unspoken weight that lingers in the air. And yet, among that silence, there were voices that refused to vanish. In the 1970s, younger generations began to dig up the truth. They demanded acknowledgement, justice, and honesty. Their movement led to one of the most significant moral reckonings in modern American history. In 1980, the U.S. government formed a commission to investigate the internment camps. The findings shattered decades of denial. There had been no military necessity, no credible threat, no espionage. The report concluded that what had happened was the result of racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It was a brutal truth that the nation could no longer hide from. For the survivors who were still alive, the Commission's words were both a vindication and a heartbreak. Vindication, because the lie was finally broken. Heartbreak, because it had taken nearly 40 years for anyone to listen. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. The government officially apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans and offered each surviving internee $20,000 in reparations. But the apology, while historic, came too late for many. Thousands had already passed away, their stories untold, their pain unacknowledged. For those who received it, the check could never repay the stolen years, the dismantled families, or the dignity that had been taken from them. Yet even amidst the injustice, there had been moments of extraordinary courage. During the war, thousands of young Japanese American men, many of them from inside those very camps, volunteered to fight for the United States. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit that would become one of the most decorated in American military history. They fought across Europe with unmatched bravery, rescuing Allied soldiers, storming Nazi defenses, and earning thousands of medals for valor. Their motto was "Go for broke," and they did risking everything for a country that had branded their families as enemies. While their parents and siblings remained behind fences, they fought for ideals that America itself had momentarily forgotten. When they returned home, there were no parades, no celebrations. The country they had defended still looked at them with suspicion. But they carried their service as quiet proof that loyalty isn't defined by skin or ancestry. It is defined by integrity. Over the years, many of the former campsites faded back into the landscape. Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain names that once marked entire worlds of confinement became ghostly footprints in the desert. But if you stand there today, you can still feel something. The wind moves across the empty plains, carrying the echoes of laughter, of sorrow, of lives that were paused but never broken. The internment camps stand as a haunting reminder of how fragile freedom can be. It doesn't take an enemy invasion to destroy it, just fear, prejudice, and the wrong people in power. The imprisonment of Japanese Americans wasn't an isolated event. It was a reflection of a nation's deep contradictions. A country founded on liberty, yet so quick to betray its own citizens when panic took hold. The truth is that America didn't need bombs or spies to compromise its values. It did it willingly, to itself. The story of the camps isn't just about the past. It's a mirror for the present. Every generation faces its own moments of fear and division. The question is whether we recognize the signs before history repeats itself in a new disguise. For those who lived through the camps, the return to normal life was never complete. Many carried the weight quietly, never asking for sympathy, just hoping their children might live in a better America than the one that had turned against them. And in a way, that hope was its own act of defiance. Because despite everything, the imprisonment, the loss, the silence, they never stopped believing in the very ideals that had betrayed them. They rebuilt. They reimagined what belonging meant. They proved through endurance alone that identity cannot be erased by fear or law. The story of Japanese internment is not a story of defeat. It is a story of survival of human dignity, persevering through institutional cruelty. It is a story that forces us to look directly at the darker corners of American democracy and ask how many freedoms we are willing to sacrifice when fear takes the wheel. And most of all, it's a story that warns us. Liberty doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes slowly, law by law, order by order, justification by justification, until suddenly you wake up one morning and freedom is something you used to have. By the time the last of the camps closed in 1946, America had moved on. Soldiers came home, factories shifted from weapons to consumer goods, and the baby boom began. The country was rebuilding itself, powerful, proud, and ready to forget. But for thousands of Japanese Americans, forgetting wasn't an option. They had lost nearly everything: homes, businesses, savings, entire communities. Families that once thrived in California, Washington, and Oregon now found themselves scattered, trying to piece together lives that no longer fit. The government told them to resettle, to blend back in, to be quiet and grateful. But rebuilding in a nation that had turned its back on you required more than resilience. It demanded forgiveness that few could truly feel. Many moved inland, away from the coasts, hoping anonymity would offer protection. They took whatever work they could find: farming, cleaning, cooking, factory shifts, anything to survive. Entire generations learned to live invisibly, to avoid drawing attention. Parents taught their children not to speak Japanese in public, not to question authority, not to make waves. Silence became a survival skill. But beneath that quiet surface, the scars ran deep. Marriages fractured under the weight of what had happened. Fathers who had been community leaders before the war now felt powerless, stripped of dignity. Mothers, once the pillars of family strength, carried hidden grief for the children who had grown up behind fences. Some never recovered. And the children, those who had spent their earliest years surrounded by barbed wire, carried their own confusion. To them, the camp was normal. They had played in the dust, made friends in the barracks, learned the Pledge of Allegiance under the watch of armed guards. For many, the realization that their own country had imprisoned them came later, like a delayed heartbreak. Yet history has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply buried. By the 1960s, as America faced new struggles for civil rights, the silence surrounding the camps began to break. The young Japanese Americans, the Nisei and Sansei, started asking the questions their parents had been too afraid to voice. Why had this happened? Who had decided it was necessary? And most of all, why had so many remained silent? The timing was no coincidence. Across the nation, people were challenging injustice, marching for equality, protesting wars, demanding accountability from those in power. The story of the internment fit into that larger awakening, a reminder that freedom wasn't guaranteed and justice wasn't automatic. Activists and historians began to unearth the truth: records, photos, government memos. What they found was damning. The military necessity argument used to justify the camps had been based on lies and paranoia. The FBI and Navy had both concluded that Japanese Americans posed no threat. Their findings were ignored. Instead, wartime hysteria and racism had shaped the policy, a policy that swept up 120,000 people, most of them citizens, without trial or evidence. It was the largest forced incarceration of civilians in U.S. history. When the truth began to emerge, the country was forced to confront an uncomfortable mirror. America prided itself as the land of liberty, the beacon of democracy. Yet within living memory, it had caged its own citizens based on ancestry alone. One of the loudest voices demanding justice was that of Fred Korematsu. During the war, Korematsu had defied the internment order and gone into hiding. He was caught, arrested, and convicted of violating military law. But decades later, he took his case back to court, determined to prove that his country had been wrong. In 1983, a federal judge finally overturned Korematsu's conviction. It was a symbolic victory, proof that the truth, though delayed, could still find daylight. But the scars of that injustice could never be fully erased. Korematsu would go on to spend his life fighting for civil rights, warning that what happened to Japanese Americans could happen again to anyone, if fear ever outweighed justice. That fear, that same pattern of panic and prejudice, didn't vanish after World War II. It reappeared in new forms, targeting new groups: immigrants, refugees, Muslims, Latin Americans. At each turn, the same logic returned. It's for safety. It's temporary. It's necessary. The faces changed, but the fear stayed the same. That's why remembering the internment, I sent T just about honoring the past. It is about defending the present. As survivors aged, they began to speak in classrooms, documentaries, and public hearings. They shared stories they had once locked away, how the guards watched them through rifle scopes, how dust storms swept through cracks in the barracks, how they sang songs at night to drown out the silence. These stories weren't just history lessons, they were warnings. In 1988, the U.S. government issued an official apology. The Civil Liberties Act declared that the internment had been a grave injustice. President Reagan, signing the act, said, "Here we admit a wrong. Here we affirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law." For many, those words were powerful, but not enough. An apology cannot rebuild a life, or return a lost home, or erase the years spent behind wire. It cannot undo the humiliation of being labeled an enemy for the color of your skin. But it mattered. It was acknowledgement, something the survivors had waited decades to hear. In the years since, the story of the internment has slowly entered textbooks, museums, and films. Manzanar is now a National Historic Site. Visitors walk the same paths where families once stood under guard, reading plaques that tell fragments of what happened. But the silence of the desert holds more truth than any monument could. Because when the wind moves through those empty fields, it carries voices of children reciting lessons in makeshift classrooms of mothers, cooking rice on oil stoves of fathers, standing outside at dusk, staring past the fences, dreaming of freedom. Those voices still echo, asking the same question America must keep answering. How could this happen here? It's a question that still matters. In moments of crisis, after wars, attacks, pandemics, unrest, fear can turn democratic societies into something darker. The Japanese internment wasn't born from pure hatred alone, but from fear that went unchallenged. Fear mixed with authority can justify anything, even the imprisonment of the innocent. The real danger isn't in repeating history exactly as it happened. It's in thinking it couldn't happen again. Today, descendants of the internees carry the memory forward, not as a wound, but as a warning. Every generation must guard against the erosion of rights, because history has shown that injustice doesn't arrive overnight. It creeps in through laws, through silence, through the comfort of believing it won't affect me. The story of Japanese internment is a story of people who lost everything and still refuse to lose themselves. It's about endurance, dignity, and the fragile balance between safety and freedom. But above all, it's a reminder of what happens when a nation forgets its own principles. The camps are gone. The fences have rusted away. The watchtowers no longer cast shadows, but the memory endures, carried in stories, in families, in the quiet determination of those who survived. And whenever fear returns, whispering that some people don't belong, that liberty can be postponed, that safety is worth more than justice, those memories speak louder. They remind us that freedom, once taken, is never easily restored.